so much, Emilde. And not to run out of time, our last panelist, but not least, Mr. Andrew Cunningham. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Before I start my presentation, اسمحوا لي أن أقول كيف تسرني هذه الفرصة لأزور الكويت. أنا زرت الكويت مرات كثيرة ولكن في الماضي من زمان. أفتكر أن الزيارة الأخيرة كان من 10 سنة للسوء الحظ. وأنا جيت امبارح وتمشيت في الشوارع وأنا شفت كل المستجدات، المباني العالية أنا ما شفتهاش من قبل. مبروك. ولذلك النقطة الأولى لكلمتي نقطة شخصية لأشكر هيئة أسواق المال لهذه الفرصة لأزور بلادكم الكريم. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the last speaker on the last session, so what chance have I got? This is what I'll do. I've got a full presentation for you, but I'm not going to speak to all of it. I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to tell you who I am and what I've done, and therefore why I think you should listen to me. And then I'm going to give you 2 sets of recommendations, because we've heard about the principles of corporate governance all day. Well, I'm going to give you 2 sets of recommendations. One is for the community as a whole, the regulators, the regulated, and other interested parties. And then my final slide will be recommendations simply for regulated companies, the companies here who are subject to corporate governance recommendations and regulations. So, well, let me just go back. I said I visited Kuwait many times. Most of those times I was an analyst with Moody's, the rating agency. I rated Kuwaiti banks. In fact, I put in place the ratings on Kuwaiti banks many years ago. And I continued to rate Middle Eastern banks for Moody's, and then rated large European banks for Moody's, and then moved to Egypt to work for an NGO where I provided consulting work to central banks, to financial regulators, capital market regulators. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Tarif, and also the pleasure of working with Dr. Tarifi in those, Jalil Tarif and Dr. Tarifi in those situations. So I worked with capital market regulators, I worked with central banks and commercial banks, partly to help improve their governance. And more recently, I've been, among other things, conducting assessments of specific companies in the Middle East, going into those companies and advising them on how they can improve their corporate governance. And so what I'm going to say to you in the next 2 sets, that was part 1, in section 2 and section 3, is based on what I actually see in the Middle East based on my experience. So where are we trying to get to? What are our objectives? The title here is a supporting environment for corporate governance. And I would suggest to you that where we're trying to get to is an environment in which individuals and companies that are trying to improve corporate governance are helped, guided, and rewarded. And that when good corporate governance is achieved, it is recognized, celebrated, and rewarded. So I think if we can achieve that, we'll have done a good job. So how do we get there? What recommendations will I have for you? Well, I'm going to jump over these slides because I know it's late in the day. I can send you the presentation, or I believe it'll be available on the website. So let's just keep moving over that. And what would be the solutions for the communities as a whole? So after all we've heard today, what should people go out and do? I think that establishing a corporate governance institute is a very important step. And I would strongly advise that it not be attached to a local training institute. And the reason for that is most of the volume, most of the people who pass through a training institute tend to be middle-level employees, very clever people, people who are going to the top of their institutions, but they're middle-level employees. If you want to get good corporate governance moving, you've got to start at the top. You've got to start with the CEOs, the board members and the chairman. And therefore I think associating a corporate governance institute with a training body doesn't create quite the right image. And you better make sure that the head of the institute is someone who's a major figure in the business community. So someone who can pick up the phone, people will take his or her call, and they'll come to the seminar, they'll come to the briefing. You can have a younger person to run around town as your executive director or your secretary general, but you need a heavyweight to be running that institute who should be spending a significant part of his or her time on it. And you should publicise what the institute does in English and Arabic. You should create a director training programme. It's a shame that we don't have the speaker here from South Africa, because the Reserve Bank of South Africa many years ago instituted a very good training programme for directors. They teamed up with a local university and they provided courses for directors, and they were realistic. The man who did this is called Errol Kruger, and he now works for the Qatar Financial Authority. Some of you may know him. When I spoke to him about it, he said, look, if someone hasn't got a background in mathematics or risk management, there's no point trying to turn them into a mathematician. But you should enable them to ask the right questions. And so that's the sort of training that you can give this person. And I said to Errol Kruger, well, what happened if the board members didn't want to attend these classes? If they weren't enthusiastic? Did you have exams for them? And he said, no, they tended to select themselves. Once they realized that these were the expectations of directors, the people who weren't interested tended to resign. So the problem solved itself. So you do need to have a director training program. I would encourage you to have a family governance program. We've just heard very eloquently why that's so important. And I would encourage you to publish terms of reference for directors describing their responsibilities. And I would also encourage you to focus on company secretaries. If one says that the board of directors is crucial to good corporate governance, then the board of directors must have proper support. And they get that support from the company secretary. Very often I see the company secretary is actually the CEO's executive secretary, who's responsible just for sending out the minutes of the board. That's not good enough. The company secretary should have some legal training. And that's why, for a small company, it's acceptable to have your outside law firm to act in that capacity. But the company secretary has a crucial position if you're going to expect your board of directors to take on an important role. I would encourage you to create a corporate governance assessment program within Kuwait, where the Institute of Directors would take the lead and offer a service to companies where you can go in and assess them and provide recommendations to them on how they can improve their corporate governance. You can't cover every company, clearly, but you can cover some companies, and those companies hopefully can set an example. And the fourth of these general recommendations that I'm making is to create some sort of document of best practices for risk management and controls in Kuwait. And it should be focused very much on Kuwaiti companies, taking into account the particular circumstances of Kuwaiti companies, because in that way, no one can say, well, that doesn't apply to us. No one can say, well, that's very good for international standards, but we're Kuwait and the things are different here. You should do it for yourselves, for companies here in Kuwait. Now, before I move to my final slide, I find that people often ask me, well, and these are regulated companies. All right, they say, I get it. I'm committed to corporate governance. What do you actually want me to do? Right, don't tell me to read another corporate governance code. Don't tell me to go to another conference. What do you want me to do? And we, as advocates of corporate governance, have got to be able to answer that question. What should I do tomorrow morning? So those of you in this room who are regulated companies? I'm going to answer that question as I would. In my opinion, you may have different views. What should you do tomorrow morning? You should create a board of directors governance committee. And if you're a small company, then just make one board member responsible for governance. And the first task should be to develop a code of corporate governance for the company. That's where you start, by expressing your commitment to get the job done. And you do that through having a code of conduct for your company. So that's my first task for you. Second task for tomorrow morning is start the process of appointing a company secretary, and I just referred to this. And if you're a small company, as I said, your outside law firm could do this job. This shows that the board is being seen as a critical decision-making body. And the first thing you should do, develop a job description and have the company secretary meet all of the board members. What's the third thing I do tomorrow morning? I create an audit committee, and for small companies, I'd make one well-qualified board member responsible for overseeing audit. Now, I know that most of you are going to have audit committees already. I understand that. So my remarks are directed more to small companies who maybe don't, and what I'd say is make sure you have a job description. Make sure all the important control functions are described and assigned to people. You don't always have to have these as full-time jobs. What is important is that the function is well described and then properly assigned. And I've seen companies that have an internal auditor who's half-time. I've seen someone having a compliance officer that's half-time, and that is okay, as long as that person is able to do the job properly in half-time, if it's a small company. And what's the fourth and final thing that I'd recommend you do tomorrow morning? I'd speak to your communications department about improving corporate disclosure. And if you're a small company, I'd say go to your IT manager and talk about how you can expand your website. And the first thing I'd do is disclose the director's interests. So what other companies are the directors of? And what shareholdings do they have in those other companies? What are your directors' interests? And I would also declare all shareholders who have more than 1% in your own company. Right? And I appreciate in some jurisdictions here in the Middle East that's already required, but that should be a minimum condition. So that's how I would answer the question, okay, what do you want me to do tomorrow morning? I know it sounds simple, but from what I've seen, a lot of companies have not implemented this. Rome was not built in a day. The road to China begins with a single step. I know you're some way down the road. I think we're all committed to implementing good corporate governance in the Middle East. I've said that already, that corporate governance starts at the top. Training company staff on corporate governance is important, but if you want to make an impact in the short and medium term, you have to get board members and company chairmen actively involved. Good luck.
Thank you, Andrew, and I should commend you on the tips that you provided for the companies, and they are well articulated and thought of, and hopefully authorized persons or authorized companies would apply and follow suit from day one. Hopefully. With this, we come to an end for our third panel, and this is the last panel for the day. And I should thank you and thank our distinguished panelists for fulfilling the request of the CMA to present today, and hopefully that the audience have gained from the shared experience that was presented today. And shukran jazilan.
ختاما، كانت هذه محاولة رائدة من قبل هيئة أسواق المال الكويتية لجسر الهوة في مجال الحوكمة نشكر للضيوف والمدعوين مشاركتهم وتلبيتهم للدعوة، آملين أن تكون هذه الندوة قد حققت الأهداف المرجوة منها. شكرا وإلى اللقاء في مرات أخرى إن شاء الله.